Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. I was 27 when my cousin Julian called and asked if I could come help him with something delicate in New Orleans. We hadn't talked in years, nothing dramatic, just time and distance doing what it does to families. Last I heard, he'd been living in the Garden District working as a guide for cemetery tours, which made sense. He always had a thing for the theatrical. When we were kids, he'd dress up in a top hat and cape and pretend to summon ghosts in our grandmother's backyard. Back then it was harmless, funny even. But something in his voice on the phone that night didn't sound like the cousin I remembered. He sounded off, soft-spoken, like someone had taken the sharp edges off his words. He asked if I could come stay with him for a while, said he needed help watching the veil. I thought he was being poetic or weird. I said yes anyway. Something in me couldn't say no. Julian always had that effect on people. I hadn't been to New Orleans in years. The moment I stepped off the train, I was swallowed by the heat and that strange perfume the city wears: magnolia, diesel, fried food, and something older that seeps up from the cracks in the cobblestone. Julian met me outside the station wearing black slacks and a button-down shirt like he was headed to a funeral. He looked pale, thinner than I remembered, like he'd lost a lot of weight quickly. He hugged me, but it was brief. No smile. Just a nod and a glad you came. When I asked him what exactly I'd come for, he just said, "You'll see tonight." Then he changed the subject and spent the ride back talking about how the rain never really stopped anymore. How the ground was too soft now, too ready to open up. His house was a narrow shotgun-style place wedged between two boarded-up buildings near Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. It was beautiful in the way old New Orleans homes are: peeling paint, wrought iron balconies, windows tall and thin like church panes. Inside, everything smelled faintly of incense and mildew. He'd set up a guest room for me with clean sheets, candles, and an old fan that clicked with every rotation. It was charming in a way, but also eerie. The ceilings were high and shadowed. The walls felt like they were leaning in, listening. And in the hallway outside my room, a single black veil hung on a nail, lace, delicate, nearly old. I asked Julian about it, and he froze mid-step. "That's hers," he said quietly. Then, after a beat, "You'll see." At dinner, he finally told me what this was all about, or at least part of it. Over bowls of gumbo and cornbread, he explained that every year, during the first week of October, something happened in the cemetery. "She comes," he said, eyes locked on his plate. I asked who. He looked up. "The widow. She wears the veil, she walks the rows, and she picks someone." I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. His face didn't move. He went on to explain that every man in our family had taken a turn watching for her since the 1800s, when our great-great-something grandfather had invited her in. I asked what that meant, but he wouldn't elaborate. Just said it was a debt that needed repaying. Year after year, generation after generation. "She doesn't like to be ignored," he said. "She notices absence. She notices when we stop grieving." I asked again who she was. He just said she was someone's wife. Now she's everyone's loss. I should have walked away. I should have said no. But Julian looked so tired, so certain, like the years had been drained from him a drop at a time. He wasn't asking for help with a haunted tour or some elaborate family tradition. He was asking for protection. Or maybe witness. Something in his voice made it clear that this wasn't just a spooky legend. Generational. Like some part of our blood had been tied to the crypt walls of that cemetery long before we were even born. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But I believed in the weight people carried. I believed in grief. And something about the word veil stuck with me. How it could mean mourning. How it could mean hiding. How it could mean a thin layer between two worlds. I told him I'd help. I told him I'd stay the week. I told him I didn't believe in curses or widows or family debts. But deep down, I knew I was lying. Because the moment I walked past that veil in the hallway, I felt watched, and I knew, whatever this was, it had already started. Julian didn't explain everything at once. It came out in fragments over the course of the next day, like each detail was its own burden that needed time to be carried. We sat in the front room with the windows shuttered tight despite the bright October sun outside, the only light coming from a set of beeswax candles that cast long shadows against the ceiling. There were no electronics in the house, no TV, no radio, and barely any signal for phones. "That was intentional," he said. "She listens when the air's too still. You don't want your voice getting stuck in the static." I didn't argue, not then, because the way he said it, it wasn't superstition. It was a survival tactic, like checking a locked door before going to sleep. You do it whether or not you believe in burglars. It just becomes part of how you live. Julian laid out the rules that night, scribbled into a leather-bound journal that looked older than either of us. The pages were brittle, the ink faded in places, but the handwriting was neat and careful. "Each night of the week," he said, "we take turns keeping vigil. She comes between midnight and 2:33 a.m., never earlier, never later." He tapped the page. "That time is important." I asked why. He said no one knows for sure. Maybe it's when she died. Maybe it's when she was buried. Maybe it's just when grief sinks deepest into the bones. The first 3 nights, he said, are observation only. Watch from inside the house. No lights, no movement, no sound. Just watch. If she walks past and doesn't stop, you're safe. If she lingers, pray. On the 4th night, you walk the perimeter of the cemetery slowly. Alone, you don't speak, you don't carry metal, and above all, you don't look directly at her face, not even if she calls your name, especially if she does. By the 7th night, he said, you'll know if she's marked you. If she has, there's nothing you can do. You just leave the veil at her crypt and hope that it's enough. I wrote everything down word for word, trying not to laugh. It sounded like the kind of thing an old cult would come up with, or maybe an elaborate urban legend passed down through high schoolers. But Julian didn't smile once while explaining it. He looked like he was giving me directions out of a minefield. He Tomley owned since 1842. She's buried in ours, he said flatly. Or something is. He refused to go inside. Hadn't stepped through the cemetery gates in 2 years. Said the last time he tried. He collapsed halfway down the row and woke up with a nosebleed and a bruise shaped like a handprint on his shoulder. Said the priest blessed him twice and still wouldn't go near the place. She's strongest with us, Julian said. Blood calls blood. That night he showed me the tools, not weapons, tools. A brass key to the cemetery gates, a silver pocket watch that ticked backward, a tin of salt, a candle made from black wax wrapped with hair. His own, he admitted. It's for grounding, he said. She forgets what's living and what's not. There was also a mirror, round and clouded, the kind you'd expect to find in an old woman's purse 100 years ago. If you're not sure if it's her, he said, look through this. If it's her, she won't show up in it. But if it's just a person. He didn't finish the sentence. I asked if she ever spoke. He nodded slowly. Not with her mouth, with yours. That part unsettled me more than anything. The idea that something might borrow your voice. That grief might not be something you carry, but something that speaks through you. At midnight, we turned off the lights and sat in the dark, facing the tall front windows. The veil still hung in the hallway behind us. I couldn't stop glancing at it. Julian said she always comes from the west, always walks the same path between the iron gate and the family crypt. She doesn't float, he said. That's what people always expect. But she walks. Her shoes are old, cracked. You can hear her coming before the stone. You hear her coming before you see her. We waited for almost 2 hours. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no shapes. Just the low hum of the city at night, muffled by walls thick with moss and memory. But even with nothing to see, I couldn't shake the tension in my gut. It was like waiting for a door to open without knowing what was on the other side. When 2:33 passed, Julian exhaled like someone who hadn't breathed since childhood. First night's the easiest, he said. She doesn't like new faces. She tests them first. I wanted to ask what happened if she liked you, but I didn't, because the silence between us already knew the answer. On the 2nd night, I took the first shift alone. Julian said that was how it had to be. She won't show herself if I'm there. He told me like it was fact. She already knows me. You're the one she's looking at now. He handed me the backward ticking pocket watch and the tin of salt, and told me not to move from the window no matter what I heard. That's part of the test. She wants you to look away. She wants to see how much of yourself you're willing to give. He said it like he'd said it 100 times before. Maybe he had. Maybe he wasn't just tired. Maybe he was hollowed out, carved piece by all the nights spent waiting. I nodded like I understood, though I didn't. Not really. Not until the silence started to hum. Not until I heard her for the first time. I sat in the front room just like before, the candles unlit, the only light a sliver of moon pushing its way through the heavy clouds. The window glass was warped with age, so everything outside shimmered slightly, like looking through water. I stared down the narrow brick path that led from the cemetery gates to the family crypt. The gates stayed locked, though I knew she didn't need them to open. Julian had said, she never enters, she emerges. I didn't understand what that meant until I saw the shape start to form. Not step forward, not approach, but coalesce, like fog taking on the outline of grief. It was slow at first, a shifting shadow between the gates. Then the shape of a woman, tall and impossibly thin, draped in a long black veil that shimmered like it was soaked in dew. Her walk was deliberate, each step echoing faintly, the click of hard soles on stone carrying farther than sound should in the quiet. My mouth went dry. I didn't blink, I didn't breathe. She moved like memory, like mourning made physical. She wasn't glowing. She wasn't transparent. She was simply there, as real and rooted as the earth she walked on. She didn't look at me, not directly. But I knew she saw me. Her head turned ever so slightly toward the window as she passed, the veil hiding whatever expression lived beneath. Her hands were gloved, her dress old-fashioned, funereal. No part of her skin showed, and still, I knew she was watching me. The temperature dropped as she walked, the air suddenly thick with moisture. The scent of lilies flooding the room even though the windows were sealed shut. I fought the urge to run. Every part of my body screamed to look away, to shut my eyes, to move, do anything but keep watching. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, just like Julian told me. And as the church bell in the distance chimed 2:33, she vanished, not with a flash or a sound. just gone, like she'd never been there at all. And yet, the front step bore the faintest impression of a footprint, damp, small, real. Julian didn't ask if I saw her, he knew I had. Instead, he poured us both a shot of absinthe and raised his glass to the air. 3 more nights, he said, and clinked his glass against nothing. I asked him what would happen if we ignored the ritual. If we just left the city, skipped town, broke the cycle. He shook his head. You can leave the city. You can even leave the house. But she follows. Not forever. Just long enough to remind you that loss isn't about location. It's about weight. It's about what you carry. Then he looked at me and added, and what you leave behind. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to know if someone in our family had tried to run before. The look in his eyes said enough. They'd tried, and they hadn't made it far. Later that night, I heard something in my room. Not footsteps, not breathing. Something softer, like the sound of lace brushing across wood. I sat up, heart pounding, eyes locked on the hallway where the veil still hung. It was moving, just barely, swaying as if someone had brushed past it, but the hallway was empty. I told myself it was airflow, the old house creaking, a breeze I hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew better, because when I turned on the light, there was a single white lily resting at the foot of my bed, and underneath it a rosary, old and rusted, the beads strung with black hair. Not mine, not Julian's. I didn't touch it, I didn't sleep. I just stared out the window and waited for morning, hoping she was done with me for the night, praying I hadn't passed the first test, praying she'd move on. But part of me already knew. She had noticed me, and worse, she had plans. By the 4th day, something had changed in the house, not in a dramatic, objects floating through the air kind of way, but in the way a person changes when they've been carrying a secret too long. The walls seemed closer, the ceilings taller. The spaces between footsteps stretched longer than they should have. I started losing track of time. I'd look up from a book and realize 3 hours had passed without me moving. The candles burned slower. The shadows stretched deeper. And Julian, he wasn't himself anymore. He barely spoke. He sat by the window at all hours, lips moving like he was praying silently, fingers twitching in his lap. I caught him standing in the hallway once, facing the veil on the wall with his head bowed, whispering something I couldn't hear. When I called his name, he jumped like I'd slapped him, turned, and walked away without a word. He didn't look back. That was the first moment I truly felt afraid. Not of her, but of him. Something about him was beginning to fade. Or worse, he wasn't fading at all, he was becoming someone else. Someone closer to her. The rules began to shift too. Julian didn't say so, but I felt it. The rituals weren't enough anymore. The salt ring we'd pour along the floorboards in the evening would be scattered by morning. The mirror meant to reveal her form had developed a hairline crack straight down the center. The backward ticking pocket watch had stopped entirely, frozen at 1:11 a.m. I wound it again and again, but it wouldn't move. That same night, when I woke to the sound of soft weeping, I thought it was coming from the street below. But as I walked to the window, I realized the sound was behind me, in the hallway, right beside the hanging veil. The weeping wasn't loud. It was the kind of cry you make when you think no one can hear you, broken, breathless, empty of rage, just grief distilled into sound. I stood frozen, listening until the weeping stopped mid-breath, like someone had suddenly realized they were being watched. I started noticing other things that didn't add up. My toothbrush was wet when I hadn't used it. My coat had been moved from the hook. The lock on the front door would be unlocked each morning, no matter how many times I checked it at night. The most disturbing thing, though, came when I checked my phone one afternoon, just out of habit, not expecting a signal. There was a single photo in my camera roll I hadn't taken. It was a shot of me sleeping, not blurry, not accidental, perfectly still. And in the bottom right corner of the image, just barely in frame, a shape in black, draped in lace, no face, no hand, just fabric thin and trailing, as though she'd leaned in, not to hurt, but to look, to study, to be near. I deleted the photo, then smashed the phone against the floor. It didn't shatter, it simply went black. No warning, no reboot, just black, like it had decided it didn't want to see anymore either. Julian didn't react when I told him. He just sat there, staring out the window like he was waiting for something. When I pushed him, really pressed, asking why we were doing this, why we couldn't just burn the veil or destroy the crypt, he finally looked at me. His eyes were sunken, glassy. Because grief isn't something you get rid of, he said quietly. It's something you tend to, like a garden. You don't pull up the roots, you just keep them from overtaking the house. I asked what happened if we didn't. His voice dropped. Then the house becomes hers. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew she wasn't just haunting the cemetery. She was making her way in, slowly, steadily, like rising water. And we were the ones who opened the door, maybe years ago, maybe generations. And now we were the only things left holding it shut. That night I went to bed early, hoping that exhaustion might do what rituals couldn't. But I woke at 3:09 a.m. to the sound of the front door creaking open. Not slammed, not forced, just gently opened, like someone careful not to wake a sleeping child. I crept to the hallway and peered through the slats of the front window. There was no one outside. The gate was closed. The street was empty, but the veil was no longer on the nail. It was gone. I turned to find it and stopped cold. It was at the end of the hallway now, gently swaying on the bathroom door handle, like someone had carried it there, like someone wanted me to follow. I used to think ghosts were about death, restless spirits, echoes of pain trapped in old places, repeating old ones. But that was before I understood the truth about the widow. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a ritual, a role, a need, and whatever she had been once, a woman, a mourner, a wife, was gone now. She had been emptied out by centuries of grief and refilled with something darker, something hungry, something that needed us to keep playing along. She didn't haunt the cemetery. She haunted the people who remembered her, who let her name pass down like a rusted heirloom. She was as much a tradition as the veil on the wall or the backwards, ticking watch or the rule that said never look her in the eye. And worst of all, I realized she wasn't here to hurt us out of anger. She did it because it was all she had left. Because when the ones we lose become the only story we know how to tell, they stop being gone. They become something else, something still with us. Julian was already too far gone to see it clearly. I think a part of him had merged with her over the years, like a candle left too close to the mirror, softening, melting, fusing. He moved differently now, not tired, not broken, but hollowed, like there was more silence inside him than breath. I found him in the parlor that evening, sitting in the center of a salt circle he'd drawn by hand, murmuring prayers from a language I didn't recognize. His hands were clasped around the veil, holding it like a relic. I tried to snap him out of it, shook his shoulders, yelled his name, but he didn't even flinch. Finally, he looked up at me and whispered, "She's lonely. That's why she chooses one of us. Not to kill, to keep. She wants someone to mourn her forever. If she's remembered, she doesn't have to sleep. She doesn't have to be gone." Then he smiled weakly and said the words that sealed it for me. I was chosen. But she changed her mind when you came. That was the moment I understood. She wasn't haunting us, she was recruiting us. Not like a curse, more like inheritance. A role passed down from one grieving soul to the next. The widow wasn't a singular spirit. She was a ritual, and someone in our bloodline had made her real. Had given her shape, name, and power through belief, through devotion, through fear. And now that belief had become binding. Julian had spent years tending to her, honoring her, keeping the memory alive because he thought it was love. But it wasn't. It was submission. And now she wanted me to take his place. That night, I decided I wouldn't go through with it. I wouldn't do the final vigil. Wouldn't walk the cemetery perimeter. Wouldn't stand by the crypt with the veil in hand like a fool about to hand his life over to a story that had lived too long. I told Julian I was leaving in the morning. I told him I loved him, but that I wouldn't be part of this anymore. That I wouldn't become the next caretaker of a ghost's loneliness. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, then turned back to the window. "She's already inside," he said softly. "Whether you stay or not, that's how it works. She only needs to be remembered, and now you do. That's enough." I didn't sleep that night, not even close. I stayed in the guest room, door locked, every light on. I packed my bag before sunrise. No sign of Julian. His room was empty, bed made, veil missing from the wall. I called out for him twice, then gave up and opened the front door. And there, resting neatly on the porch steps, were two things: the backwards pocket watch, still frozen at 1:11 a.m., and a photograph. One of the ones my mother kept in the old family album. I hadn't seen it in years. It was from my childhood. A family reunion in the cemetery. My grandfather, my mother, a much younger Julian, and in the far background, barely visible, was a woman in black lace standing among the tombs. Her face obscured by a veil. I had never noticed her before. I stared at it for a long time before I folded back up and put it in my bag. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from knowing, truly knowing, that this wasn't over, that I couldn't forget her now. She had been noticed, she had been remembered, and that was all she ever needed. They say the air is always still after something terrible passes through it. Like the wind knows better than to stir up what's just settled. That's what the neighborhood felt like the morning after. Hushed. Heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath. I sat on the stone steps outside the crypt, watching the sun rise through the crooked iron gate of the cemetery. Julian's body lay beside me, cold but undisturbed. His eyes were closed, no signs of violence. No signs of peace either. Just stillness, as if he had simply stepped out of his body and left it there like a worn coat on a hanger. I tried to cry but couldn't. It was too much, too quiet. Grief, when it finally lands, doesn't crash in like a storm. It seeps slow, thick. Unshakable, I buried him that day. Just outside the family tomb without ceremony. I didn't ask permission. There was no one left to give it. Later that evening I called my mother. I told her everything. At first I expected laughter or disbelief, but she didn't sound surprised. She was quiet for a long time before she said, "I wondered when it would be your turn." That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't a secret because it was too dark to speak. It was a burden passed quietly. The way you teach someone to live with chronic pain. You don't warn them. You just hand them the tools and wait for the day they understand. She said my great-uncle had done it before Julian. That our family had always held the line. I asked if there was ever a way out. She said yes, but only if no one remembered. Grief dies in silence, she said. But we were never very good at silence, were we? Then she hung up. I stayed in New Orleans for another week. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know where else to go. The house felt empty without Julian, but not abandoned. There was a strange sense of order to it now, like the pressure had lifted slightly. The veil never returned to the wall. The backward watch never ticked again. The house became just a house, still creaky, still shadowed, but no longer waiting for anything. I packed my things slowly. I didn't want to take too much. I was afraid of bringing something with me, but I also couldn't leave everything behind. I took Julian's journal. I took the cracked mirror. I left the salt, the candle, and the rosary on the mantel just in case. 2 months passed, then 3. I moved to Asheville, tried to rebuild a version of normal, found an apartment with big windows and no attic. Things quieted down mostly. But I never stopped glancing at doorways. I never stopped waking up at 2:33 a.m., even when I hadn't set an alarm. I stopped talking to my family after a while. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. They hadn't lied to me. They just hadn't warned me. I didn't blame them. But I also didn't trust them. Grief changes the shape of your world, and I didn't like the shape mine had become. Then last week a letter arrived. No return address, no name, just a black envelope sealed with wax. Inside was a single photograph, grainy black and white, faded with time. It showed the family crypt taken from the front gate, but this time, there was someone standing beside it, a tall woman in a black lace veil, and next to her, eyes open, smiling faintly, his hand resting gently on hers. There was no message, no date, just that image. I keep it in a drawer now, wrapped in cloth, buried beneath papers I pretend I'll get to. But I don't throw it away, I don't burn it. Because part of me knows the truth, she's not gone. She just walked a little farther down the line. And someday, when memory is sharp enough, when grief is fresh again, she'll come walking back. I never thought I'd end up living in a place like Hollow Pines. I'd never even heard of the town until the week I lost my job, got dumped, and watched my bank account sink into the kind of negative numbers that make you feel like you're being pulled backward through your own life. I had a history degree, a worn-out Honda, and a resume full of customer service gigs that never lasted more than a year. So when I saw the listing for a summer caretaker position, remote location, historical grounds, housing provided, I applied out of desperation. Not because it sounded promising, but because it sounded quiet. I needed that. I needed a way. And Hollow Pines, with its crumbling bell tower and old-growth forests, promised exactly that. The ad had been vague, seeking motivated, self-reliant individual to maintain grounds of historical cemetery property. Duties include vegetation control, minor structural observation, and record logging. The pay was bad. The expectations were strange. But what stood out most was the location, Bell Tower Hill, Hollow Pine Cemetery, East 1841. I remember staring at that name for a while. It had a rhythm to it, something almost melodic. Like a story waiting to be found. Maybe that's what drew me in. Not just the job, but the chance to live inside a piece of forgotten folklore. They called me 2 days after I applied. A man named Mr. Bellamy conducted the interview. His voice was smooth and practiced, the kind that makes you picture a man in a pressed suit. Though something about the way he cleared his throat between each question made me feel like he was reading from a script. He didn't ask much about my skills. He didn't even ask if I had experience with cemeteries. Just if I could arrive within the week, if I was sensitive to spiritual energy, and if I had any known heart conditions. That last one made me laugh nervously. He didn't. I said yes to all of it. When I arrived, the town was barely there. A single main street with a diner, a gas pump, a boarded-up general store. The locals didn't wave. They didn't glare either. They just stared like they were waiting to see how long I'd last. Bell Tower Hill was at the far edge of town, past a wooden sign so weathered you could only make out half the letters. The road curved up into dense trees that swallowed most of the sky. I had to park halfway and walk the rest due to a fallen log across the gravel path. By the time I reached the gate, I was sweating and breathless, the cicadas screaming all around me like static turned up too loud. The house was small, colonial, tucked just past the main gate. Beyond it stood the bell tower itself, tall, rusted, and skeletal, like someone had peeled the skin off a church steeple and left its bones to dry. Each grave in the cemetery had a narrow chain that stretched from the headstone up the slope toward the tower, where they vanished through a metal grate at the base. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I didn't want to, not yet. I chalked it up to some antique safety ritual and went inside the house, where a manila envelope waited for me on the kitchen counter. Inside, a map, a checklist, and a single-page letter handwritten in looping cursive. Welcome, your duty is simple. Walk the rows, log changes, document disturbances. Do not enter the bell tower. Do not touch the chains. If you hear the bell, log the time and go inside immediately. Do not investigate. No signature. Just a wax seal at the bottom, dark red, almost black, pressed with the image of a hanged bell. I should have turned around then. I should have called someone. But the kitchen was warm, the house smelled like old cedar, and I was tired, so damn tired of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. And here, among the ghosts and moss-covered stones, I finally felt still. I'd never had peace before. Hollow Pines offered it freely. All I had to do was follow a few rules, and I've always been good at following rules. Until the bell rang, and I didn't. The first week passed slowly, like the air up there moved at half speed. Each morning, I woke to the sound of birds I couldn't name and the endless rustle of trees and wind that didn't seem to touch anything. The job itself was easy, mechanical even. I'd walk the rows of gravestones with a clipboard, ticking off the ones I'd already logged. Each headstone had a number engraved at the base, and a small iron ring at the top that the chain looped through. There were over 160 marked graves in total, some so old the letters had worn away to soft dips in the stone. My checklist included things like soil disturbed, markings present, chain alignment, and stone movement. It sounded like a joke at first, like a scavenger hunt designed by a mortician. But the thing is, some of the chains did move. Not a lot, not all at once, but every day, at least one would be a few inches longer, pulled taut in a new direction, like something underground had shifted just enough to tug on the line above. I documented everything just like the letter instructed. Never touched the chains, never tried to follow them to their endpoint beneath the tower. Sometimes I'd kneel near them and listen, more out of curiosity than belief. I never heard anything at first. But after the third night, there was this vibration, barely noticeable, like standing too close to a speaker with no music playing. It was constant, and I could feel it through the dirt. A humming tension beneath the surface, as if the whole hill was holding something just under the skin. I told myself it was seismic activity or old pipes, or maybe even an echo from the bell tower's long rusted mechanics. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I didn't want to admit it yet. I wasn't ready. Bell Tower Hill had its own rhythm. You started to feel it after a few days. There were no clocks in the house, no cell service, and the battery-operated radio only picked up a single station that played slow jazz and fire and brimstone sermons with equal regularity. My only way to track time was the sun through the trees and the pocket watch left for me in the drawer of the nightstand. It ticked quietly, but I soon realized the time it kept didn't match the days. At noon, it would show 20:14 p.m. at sunset 43, but it always struck exactly 23:03 a.m. when the tower bell rang, which I heard for the first time on my fourth night. I wasn't asleep, I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about home, about the last argument I had with my ex, about the feeling of being unwanted even when someone says they love you. And then it came, one single hollow toll, not loud, not violent, just a long low note that rolled across the house like a foghorn through the bones. I sat straight up. My mouth was dry. My hands were already reaching for the checklist on the nightstand before I even realized I was moving. I logged the time, I marked the box. And then I sat there, waiting for something else. But nothing happened. The bell didn't ring again. There were no footsteps, no shaking, no screams in the distance. Just that one long note, like a warning meant only for me. Like someone had knocked gently on my mind and then left without waiting for an answer. The next morning, the chain on grave 143 was slack. It had been tight the day before, nearly humming with tension. Now it lay limp in the grass, the ring loose where it connected to the stone. The earth around the grave looked slightly raised. I leaned in closer, thinking maybe some burrowing animal had passed through. But no, the soil wasn't broken, just lifted like something beneath had pushed up. I stared at it too long. Felt a headache start to pulse behind my eyes. I marked it on the sheet and moved on, refusing to let my mind wander where it wanted to go. By the end of the week, I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement near the tree line, a shape ducking behind the bell tower just as I turned. It never happened head on, only in the periphery, like whatever it was knew how to avoid direct attention. I told myself it was paranoia, sleep deprivation, forest hallucinations. But that night, while I was brushing my teeth, I glanced in the mirror and saw someone standing in the reflection behind me. Outside on the porch, a tall figure in a long coat or robe, face obscured by the angle, just watching. I spun around, no one there, porch empty, door locked. But when I checked the floor, I found a footprint in the dust. Not a shoe, not a boot. Just bare skin, long toes, heel pressed down hard enough to crack the layer of dirt. I wiped it away before I could think too much about it. If I acknowledged it, it would become real. I wasn't ready for real. I considered leaving the next day. Drove my car down the hill only to find the road blocked by another tree, this one not fallen, but cut. Clean, deliberate. Like someone didn't want me leaving just yet. I stood there for a long time, staring at the stump, the sap still fresh, the wood still fragrant. Then I walked back up the hill, picked up my clipboard, and resumed the rounds. I told myself it was just a job, just a weird isolated cemetery gig with some local flair and too many rules. But the bell had already rung, and I was still listening. I don't know when the job stopped being a job and started feeling like something I'd signed my name to without reading the fine print. Maybe it was the second time the bell rang. Another single toll in the dead of night, soft as breath, but so heavy I felt it in my stomach. Maybe it was the long, slow walk through the cemetery the next morning, where every stone looked just a little different, a little cleaner, like someone had wiped them down while I slept. Or maybe it was the sound I heard coming from the bell tower just before dawn. Not the bell, but something else, something like wind passing through teeth. A whistling that rose and fell like breathing. I stood outside the tower for a long time that morning, staring up at the rusted cage of it. The chains from the graves all snaked their way underground and remerged at the tower's base, where they disappeared into a dark, grated pit. I had never seen the grate open. Never saw a keyhole or lock, just metal, thick and old and silent. The The ground around it pulsed faintly like it was exhaling through the roots. The house itself wasn't safe anymore, or at least it didn't feel like it. Every night, something shifted. The floors creaked differently, the shadows changed shape. I'd find cabinet doors open that I'd closed. One night, all the chairs in the kitchen were turned to face the windows, even though I hadn't touched them. I stopped turning on the radio because the only station I could get began to play distorted recordings. Old sermons warped with static, voices slowed down or loop, some spliced together with distant cries or coughing fits that didn't sound entirely human. I told myself it was signal interference. But every time I unplugged the damn thing, it turned itself back on within the hour. Eventually, I buried it under a pile of towels in the linen closet and stopped going in there at night. I began to realize how completely cut off I was. There were no neighbors, no visitors, no check-ins from Mr. Bellamy or anyone else who'd hired me. It was like the town below had forgotten I was here, or had never acknowledged me in the first place. I made the trip down again, on foot this time, thinking maybe I could find a working phone or hitch a ride out. But the gas station was shuttered and the single diner was closed with a sign that simply read, "It was late July." The next night was different. The bell didn't ring at 2033 like it usually did. It rang at 2018, once, then again at 2019, then twice more in quick succession. The sound wasn't hollow this time. It was wet somehow, like the bell had been submerged, like it wasn't made of metal anymore. I stood in the hallway with the clipboard pressed to my chest and counted the intervals like that would help, like that would keep me sane. Then silence. Not just quiet, but full silence. No bugs, no wind, no rustling trees. Just the feeling that something was waiting for me to make a decision. I didn't go outside that night. I locked the doors, closed every window, and sat on the floor until sunrise. When I finally went out the next morning, I found that 3 graves, the 6, Phil 117 and 223, had their chains completely unhooked from the headstones. Not snapped, not broken. Unhooked. Neatly laid down beside the stones, the iron rings still intact. The earth in front of each grave had been scraped clean of leaves and debris, as though someone had used their hands to polish it. I touched one of the rings just lightly with my boot. The ground trembled underneath, subtle but undeniable. I stepped back, logged it, and nearly choked when I saw the final line of the checklist that I hadn't noticed before. At the very bottom of the page, in faded ink, it read, "If chain is found, remove, document, and replace. If chain cannot be replaced, notify the bell." I didn't know how to notify a bell. I didn't know what the bell was. The tower itself had no stairs, no doors, no ladder. Just metal and chain and the hollow mouth where the clapper used to be. But that afternoon, after hours of pacing, I found something I hadn't seen before, hidden behind the tool shed. A small wooden trapdoor in the grass. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even dusty. And when I opened it, a narrow staircase wound down into the dark, deeper than the roots of any tree. I didn't go down. Not then. I closed the hatch. I placed a brick on top of it. And then I went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote in my journal for the first time in weeks. I think I've been chosen for something. I just don't know what I agreed to. By the second week, I stopped checking the graves every day. The checklist no longer felt like a guide. It felt like a trap. The more I followed it, the more the patterns twisted. Chains moved without logic. Gravestones I'd documented would vanish, only to reappear 2 days later with different names. And worse, the numbers beneath the names, those neat little identifiers, began to show dates that hadn't happened yet. August 14th, August 23rd. One even read September 3rd, etched in perfectly weathered stone. My birthday. I rubbed at that one until my fingertips went raw. But the numbers never faded. Just sat there beneath the name of someone I didn't recognize, waiting like a message I wasn't ready to read. I tried to call for help again, dragging my car battery into the kitchen to charge my phone. It worked just long enough to light up the screen. No signal, no whip, but a single voicemail had somehow downloaded. It was blank, just soft, raspy breathing and a slow ticking sound, like the old watch I kept by the bedside, only slower, more deliberate, as though the seconds were being stretched on purpose. I deleted the message and threw the phone into a drawer. I haven't checked it since. That night I woke up with the taste of dirt in my mouth. Not mud, not soil. Grave dirt. You know it when you taste it. Damp. Bitter, clinging to the tongue like old blood. I rushed to the bathroom and spat into the sink, watched black grains swirl down the drain, and when I looked into the mirror, my eyes didn't reflect right. The room was dim, sure, but the pupils, my pupils, looked wrong. Too round, too still, like they weren't adjusting to light at all. I blinked once, twice, and they stayed the same. I smashed the mirror. It didn't shatter, just cracked in the shape of a web, as if something had struck it from the inside. Sleep became harder after that. I stopped trusting the bed, so I started dozing in the armchair near the window, where I could keep one eye on the bell tower. But even that didn't help. I'd wake up with mud on my shoes, chain grease on my fingertips. Once I found a dried flower clutched in my hand, a lily, bruised and bent, still warm like it had just been picked. I hadn't left the house. I hadn't moved. At least I don't think I had. The tower began to ring on its own schedule, sometimes once, sometimes 3 times in a row, never more than that. The sound didn't echo anymore. It sounded close, as if the bell had moved, or as if my ears had grown tuned to it in some way. On one particularly heavy night, it rang 4 times. I waited until morning before checking the cemetery. I found 5 new graves. 5 I was sure hadn't been there the day before. No names, just numbers. One of them, near the back fence, had a half-buried shoe beside it. A Nike sneaker, worn and muddy, but not old. I owned the same pair. I didn't check mine until that night, and when I did, my right shoe was clean, but the left one had streaks of dried soil in the treads. The hatch behind the shed started opening on its own. I never saw it happen, but every morning it would be cracked an inch wider, just enough to show that someone or something was inviting me to come down. One night I finally braced myself and looked inside. I brought a flashlight, extra batteries, a crowbar. The staircase spiraled down into thick black stone, the air humid and metallic. I counted 48 steps before my light flickered and died. Not just dimmed. Cut off. I turned around, climbed back up, sealed the hatch again. This time I bolted it with 2 rusted fence bars I wrenched off the boundary line near grave 026. Since then, the banging has started. Not every night, just on the ones when I think I might sleep. The worst came 3 nights ago. I heard a knock at the door. 3 firm raps, polite, almost like someone asking to borrow a cup of sugar. I didn't answer, of course. Just sat there in the chair with a kitchen knife in my lap, breathing through my nose. Then the voice came, soft and tired, muffled through the wood. "You forgot to check the graves?" I didn't move. It knocked again. "Some of them are waking up crooked," it said. "Their chains are too loose." I sat there until sunrise, and when I finally opened the door, there was no one outside. But in the dirt just past the porch, a long drag mark curved through the grass like something had been pulled backward slowly against its will. The chains are all slack now. Some of them are beginning to lift at night, floating off the ground as if whatever they're tied to is rising to meet the surface. I tried burying one with rocks. I woke the next morning to find the rocks neatly stacked beside the grave, arranged in the shape of a bell. I don't think I was hired to care for the grounds. I think I was brought here to witness something. Or maybe just to keep the rhythm going long enough for it to finish whatever cycle it's on. I'm starting to think I'm not the first one to live here. That others came before me, and that they either left or became part of it. I keep hearing whispers now, from the walls, from the chains, from the trapdoor. They're saying something I can't fully understand. But one word keeps repeating: tend. It started with the wind dying, not fading, dying. One moment the trees were whispering like they always did, a sound I'd grown strangely comforted by. The next, nothing. Like someone had put their hand over the mouth of the world. I stepped outside that night because the silence was too loud to ignore, and as I passed the threshold of the house, I realized the chains were humming. Not vibrating, not swaying, humming. A low, continuous tone, barely audible, but if you stood between the rows of graves you could feel it in your bones, like your skeleton was being tuned to a frequency you weren't meant to hear. I walked slowly between the stones, scanning the grounds with my flashlight, which was now starting to flicker even on fresh batteries. I tried telling myself it was the moisture in the air, or some odd battery defect, but I already knew better. When I reached the center of the cemetery, the bell rang again. But this time, it wasn't from the tower. It was from underneath. The sound came up through the soil, deep and booming, like something was trying to tull its way back to the surface. I staggered backward, almost tripping over one of the lifted chains. I looked down to see the grave it belonged to, number 066. Moving, the soil pulsed, then cracked, not like a sinkhole or an animal burrow. It heaved, as if something was pushing from beneath with wet, deliberate force. I don't remember deciding to dig. I just remember dropping to my knees and clawing at the dirt like a man possessed, bare-handed, fingers bleeding. I only stopped when I touched fabric. It was a sleeve. Tattered, soaked through, flesh-colored but wrong, gray and slick with rot. And wrapped around the wrist, tangled in the chain like it had been fed through bone, was a tag. An ID badge, mine. My name? My fob, title, caretaker, Bell Tower Hill. The badge was old, scratched, the plastic fogged. But it was me, not someone who looked like me. Me, I let out a sound I'd never made before. Not a scream. More like a strangled moan, the sound a person makes when they see a future they can't escape, already buried beneath their feet. I stumbled back, scrambling away on hands and knees, mud in my mouth, the chain clinking behind me like it was trying to follow. I ran, slipping twice, and slammed the house door behind me so hard the frame cracked. I sat against it until morning, holding the badge in my lap, watching as the photo faded slowly to white over the next few hours like it was disintegrating in real time. By sunrise, it was blank, just a smudged plastic card and the broken promise of identity. I knew then that the graves weren't just graves. They weren't final. They weren't full. Or maybe they were, but only temporarily. Whatever lived here, whatever power ran beneath Bell Tower Hill, it wasn't about death. Not really. It was about exchange. About debt, about someone something, ensuring that no plot remained empty for long. I wasn't just the caretaker, I was a placeholder. That day, I tried to break the rules. I took one of the chains and tried to pull it free entirely. It wouldn't budge. I wrapped it around a cinder block and heaved. The cinder block cracked. The chain didn't. I tried cutting one with a hacksaw I found in the shed. After 5 minutes of sparks and effort, I'd barely scratched the surface. But when I returned the saw to its place, something had carved a single word into the wood of the shed's door, BND. The hatch behind the shed was wide open again. This time the stairwell was lit by something I couldn't see. Not light exactly, but visibility, as though the shadows had receded to invite me down. I stood at the top, 1 foot on the first step, my mouth dry, my fingers clenched white around the doorframe. I don't know what I would have done if the voice hadn't come. I probably would have gone down. I probably would have disappeared like the others. But the voice saved me. It came from one of the gravestones. Soft, female horse with dirt and time. It said, "Don't go below. That's where they forget you." I turned and ran. Again, just like I always do. And when I looked back, the hatch was closed. I didn't close it. Part 5 complete, first incident coming up next. Part 6 escalation, where the narrator is directly threatened and the truth behind the bell and its toll becomes undeniable. Let me know when you're ready to continue. I left the front door open that night. I don't remember deciding to, but when I woke up around 1:45 a.m., chilled and slick with sweat, I could see it swinging gently on its hinges. The fog had crept inside, thick and low like smoke curling around the furniture, settling at my feet like something alive. There was no wind, no breeze, just fog, breathing in the doorway, and something standing in it. I didn't see it at first, not fully, just a shape. Too tall, shoulders crooked like they'd been forced through a too narrow tunnel. Its arms hung at its sides, but too long, too still, like pendulums at rest. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, it was gone. Only the fog remained, but the house was colder and the hallway light had gone out. I forced myself to move, to step into the hallway, and I immediately felt something wrong with the floorboards. They pulsed beneath me, like the house itself had a heartbeat, and it was speeding up. When I passed the bedroom door, I saw something written on the wall in what looked like charcoal. Long vertical slashes stacked in uneven rows like tallies. There were over 100 of them. I only made it to 30 before I realized the final one was still wet. I touched it, cold. Smudgy, I wiped my fingers on my jeans and kept walking. Outside, the bell tower loomed against the moonless sky. I had the overwhelming urge to run, to grab my keys, charge the car battery again, do anything. But when I stepped onto the porch, I saw that the chains were moving. Not just swaying, slithering, curling and uncurling across the grass like iron snakes twitching with purpose. They weren't attached to the graves anymore. They were searching. I stumbled backward and my heel caught on something. A stone I hadn't noticed before, planted directly in the center of the path. I looked down and my stomach turned. It was a new headstone. No number, no name. Just a fresh, cut slab with a phrase chiseled deep tier T. Burl remembers. My mouth went dry. My throat locked up. I backed into the doorframe, nearly falling again. That's when the sound came. Not the bell itself this time, but the clapper, swinging freely for the first time in weeks. A metallic groan, one loud ring, pure and low and final. Then another, and another. I fell to my knees, hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't external anymore. It was inside my head, inside my bones. That was when the house began to shake. Not like an earthquake, not a tremor. This was a targeted vibration coming from beneath the floorboards. Something was rising and the house didn't like it. The wood strained, nails popped from the beams, windows fogged over with condensation and fingerprints, dozens of them, pressing from the inside of the glass. I crawled toward the back room away from the living area, toward the closet where I'd stuffed the cursed radio. It had turned itself on again. But this time it wasn't jazz or sermons. It was a recording of my voice reading off the checklist in a flat, monotone rhythm. My voice, but distorted, stretched, layered with whispers that didn't match the cadence. And then a second voice joined in, mimicking mine, but changing the words slightly. If the chains are loose, let them out. If the stone is gone, take its place. If the bell rings thrice, you are claimed to. You are claimed. I smashed the radio. It sparked and hissed but wouldn't shut off. I finally threw it out the back door into the grass, where it landed near the shed, which was now wide open. The hatch behind it glowed faintly, just visible beyond the trees. The light wasn't fire. It wasn't electric. It pulsed like breath. And with every breath, I could hear the chains moving faster. Not outside now. Inside the walls, scraping, tapping, rapping. That was when the whisper came again. Not from outside. From the vent above the kitchen, it said my name, slowly. Like it was learning the shape of it. You're the last. It's your turn. I grabbed my journal, my bag, whatever I could fit into it. I bolted for the car, which I'd pushed halfway back to the road earlier that day. The battery wasn't charged, but I didn't care. I planned to coast it down the hill. Maybe I could reach the bottom. Maybe I could just leave the keys in and roll Flintstone style. I never got the chance. As I turned the ignition out of instinct, the headlights flicked on for the briefest second, and standing directly in front of the car, less than 10 feet away, was a man, if you could call it that, dressed in caretaker's clothes like mine. Face sunken, eyes missing. In his right hand a chain, in his left my ID badge. He dropped it, walked into the fog and vanished. I never saw him again. But I know where he went. And I know what's waiting. I don't remember how I got the car started. I don't remember if I charged the battery, pushed it downhill, or screamed loud enough that something pitied me. All I know is that the next thing I can remember clearly is the tires scraping gravel and the bell tolling once long and low behind me. The headlights flickered, then steadied. I didn't look back, not even once. The gravel road curved like a spine through the trees, and every branch I passed looked more like a reaching hand than a limb. But I kept driving. Even after I passed the rusted Bell Tower Hill Cemetery sign, even after the paved road picked up and the trees gave way to empty fields, I kept my foot on the gas. It felt like if I slowed down, something would catch up. When I finally reached the town, just one blinking yellow light in a single gas station. I slammed on the brakes and stumbled out, half expecting the chains to follow me down the asphalt. I ran into the building like I'd just escaped a fire, babbling to the cashier that something was wrong with the cemetery, that people were buried alive, that the bell had been ringing from underground, that I'd seen graves change shape, that someone or something was calling my name from inside the walls. She just blinked at me and reached for the phone, not to call the police, but someone else. "He made it down," she said into the receiver, giving me a glance that felt more like pity than shock. "He's shaken, but he made it." Then she smiled at me like I was a child who had finally finished a chore. That's when it hit me. I wasn't the first. I wasn't even the 10th. Later that day, 2 men in crisp suits arrived. Not uniforms. No badges, just dark clothing watches and calm, tired smiles. They asked if I'd like to speak with a trauma counselor, offered me water, said they were sorry my time at Bell Tower had ended the way it did. I asked them what it was, what the bell was, what the graves were doing, why the chains moved on their own. They didn't deny any of it. They just told me the cemetery was part of a historical site undergoing spiritual restoration, and that not everyone who visits finds what they're looking for. Before I could demand real answers, one of them handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement, already signed with my name, dated weeks before I even arrived at the tower. The other man held out a small plastic bag containing my cracked phone and the now blank ID badge. "You left these behind," he said. I didn't argue. I didn't sign anything else. I got in the car and drove until I crossed 2 state lines. I ended up at a roadside motel with flickering lights and paper-thin walls. I slept with my back against the door. Every time the pipes creaked, I flinched. Every time the air conditioner rattled, I held my breath. I checked the closet 4 times that night. Nothing, no chains, no whispers. Just silence. Eventually, I started trying to rebuild a normal life. I found contract work in another state, paid cash. Got a new phone, new number, tried to forget. But there were signs I couldn't ignore. A bell chiming faintly on foggy mornings. Dirt beneath my fingernails when I hadn't touched a garden. Waking up with the faint shape of a number written on my wrist. Faded by noon, but always clear in the early hours. One morning it read 026. Another 143. I started writing them down. The list is growing. And then, last week, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a single chain link, rusted, familiar, and a slip of paper that read, "There's still a vacancy." I haven't slept since, and the worst part, last night at exactly 23:03 a.m. the wind died again, and I heard the bell. From beneath the floor. I was 19 the summer I went to stay with my Uncle Ray in the hills of western North Carolina. He lived in a part of Appalachia so quiet you could hear the creek talking to itself through the rocks. There were no street lights, no cell towers, not even a gas station unless you drove 20 miles down a winding road that made your ears pop. I just finished my first year of college, and after my mom's 3rd eviction in 2 years, I needed a place to crash that didn't come with drama or the smell of mildew. Ray offered me a guest room in exchange for helping out with some land stuff. I didn't ask what that meant. I needed sleep, food, and somewhere that didn't involve watching her boyfriend punch holes in drywall. Ray wasn't the talkative type. I hadn't seen him since I was a kid, and back then all I remembered was the smell of his pipe smoke and the way his dog wouldn't go near the back of his property. He used to work in logging, I think. Now he mostly kept to himself, and everyone in town called him Caretaker Ray. At first I thought it was just a nickname, but turns out it was literal. He was the caretaker of Old Brer Hollow Cemetery, a place even the locals didn't like to say out loud. The cemetery sat just past a cluster of rusted-out mailboxes and a leaning wooden sign that read, "No trespassing after sundown." It was huge, sprawling, really, cut into the side of a wooded hill with slanted broken gravestones that dated back to the 1800s. There were no lights, no fence, no flowers, just wind and birdsong and the smell of pine. Old town's buried here, Ray told me the day we pulled up, and then some. That was my introduction. He tossed me a pair of gloves, pointed at a rusted shed, and said, "You want to stay here, you help clean it up. Just till fall." I figured it'd be easy enough. How hard could it be to weed, walk around some old stones and rake leaves? I was wrong, dead wrong. Looking back though, there were signs, little ones. The way Ray avoided the far northwest corner even when we mowed. The way he always ended our workdays before the sun got too low. The way his voice went flat when I asked about the lantern hanging inside the shed. It was an old oil thing, glass cracked, soot stained, but it still had fuel inside. Looked like it hadn't been lit in years. Ray just said, "Don't touch it," and changed the subject. I'll skip the boring stuff. The first couple weeks were normal. I mowed, I trimmed hedges, I swept dead branches from the paths. Sometimes locals would drop off flowers for graves that had no family left. Sometimes a teenager would dare another to hop the stone wall at night, then come running out 5 minutes later looking like they'd seen a ghost. I laughed at it back then. Now, not so much. The legend started showing up in bits. At the gas station, a cashier asked, Ray still got that lantern, huh? When I nodded, he just muttered, "Poor bastard," and looked away. At the diner, an old woman in a black shawl crossed herself when I mentioned where I was staying. "She's still down there. God rest her." That's when it hit me. No one was talking about Ray. They were talking about his wife. Her name was Mabel. I found an old photo tucked into a drawer in Ray's house, black and white faded. She had kind eyes, the kind that made you trust someone instantly. She wore a dress that looked handmade, and she was standing in front of a grave smiling. I didn't ask Ray about it, I didn't need to. I overheard enough at the bar one night to put it together. Mabel died in a landslide. That much was true. It happened back in '82, during the spring thaw, when the mountain gave way behind the cemetery and swallowed part of it whole. People said half the newer graves went under. They said Mabel had been visiting her sister's plot when the earth cracked open beneath her feet. Her body was never found. Only thing left behind was a scrap of black fabric and her wedding ring, mud-caked and bent. But here's the thing, folks around Briar Hollow don't believe she died. Not really. They say Ray never stopped looking. That he stayed on as caretaker not out of duty, but out of guilt. They say he walks the cemetery every night with that old lantern. That he thinks he'll find the spot where she was buried alive. And worse, they say sometimes she answers, but I didn't believe it, of course. Not at first. I chalked it up to backwoods gossip. Small towns have a way of spinning stories to hide real pain. But something about Ray's eyes, how they darted to the tree line at dusk, how he locked the doors twice at night, started to get under my skin. One night, near the end of July, I stayed out a little too late trimming back the thickets behind the old mausoleum. Ray hadn't noticed. I figured it was no big deal. The sky was still light when I started. Just barely orange, but by the time I packed up, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and a thick blue shadow was spilling down the slopes. That's when I saw it. A light, faint, swaying, at the far end of the cemetery. It bobbed between the stones like someone walking, lantern held low. My first thought was Ray. Maybe he was checking something? But the shape was wrong. Thinner. Slighter. No sound. Just the flicker of flame and the wind brushing the grass. I called out. No answer. The light paused, then kept moving. When I reached the shed, the lantern was still hanging inside, untouched, cold. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was a trick of the eyes, heat shimmer, fireflies. Maybe even someone playing a prank. But the next morning, Ray didn't ask where I'd been, didn't even look at me. Just said, "Stay close to the house today?" And then, under his breath, so quiet I barely caught it, "T. She don't like strangers after dark." When I first arrived at Briar Hollow, I actually thought the place was peaceful. Not just quiet, but a kind of stillness that felt earned, if that makes sense. The hills stretched for miles, covered in deep green pines and mist that hung low in the mornings like it was afraid to leave. The birds didn't sing much, but when they did, it was soft and slow, like even they respected the hush over this place, and the cemetery. Yeah, it was old, crumbling, and overgrown in parts, but it had this strange beauty to it. Some gravestones leaned like they were whispering secrets to each other. Others were cracked open, half swallowed by tree roots that grew straight through the dead. There was one plot near the creek with a wrought iron fence covered in ivy, and every time I passed it, I'd swear it smelled faintly of lilac, though no flowers ever grew there. For a while I liked it, I genuinely did. I'd sit by the edge of the field during breaks, drink lemonade, and sketch the headstones. There was peace in that routine, maybe even purpose. Ray didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always practical. He taught me how to clean the stones without damaging the lichen, how to clear the footpaths with a scythe instead of a weed whacker, and how to read the weather in the way the birds moved or the trees shifted. I listened. I didn't have a lot of men in my life who actually cared if I listened. I liked the way he moved with the land, the way he didn't waste words. We got into a rhythm. Early mornings, long afternoons, dinner at 6 sharp, and lights out by 9. There was comfort in that and the predictability. For a guy who'd grown up in chaos, it felt like healing. I wasn't looking over my shoulder all the time. I wasn't waiting for the next loud fight or slammed door. Just fresh air, honest work, and a town that minded its own business. For those first few weeks, I started to think maybe the stories were just that, stories. There was a calm to the cemetery during the day that almost made you forget what it was. Birds hopped along the stone ledges, squirrels darted through the oak trees, and butterflies sometimes rested on the mossy tops of the larger headstones. Ray even showed me a hidden grove near the back, where a small circle of graves sat in a patch of ferns. Infant garden, he called it. The stones were so worn you could barely read the names anymore. But someone, Ray, I think, kept small toys on each one. A cracked porcelain rabbit, a toy car with rusted wheels, a stuffed lamb bleached gray by the sun. It was the kind of detail that stuck with you, the kind that made you believe maybe caretakers really do love the dead, and maybe the dead know it. The town of Briar Hollow was odd, sure, but not unkind. People nodded when I walked past, though they rarely stopped to chat. At the diner, they remembered my order after 2 visits. At the general store, a kid about my age offered me a ride when he saw me walking in the rain, no strings attached. It wasn't home, but it wasn't bad. I started thinking I might stay longer than the summer. I even called my mom to say things were good, which felt like lying, but also not. I told her Ray was quiet but kind, that the place was peaceful, and that I was sleeping better than I had in years. All of that was true, at least back then. I kept seeing little things that made me feel welcome. A jar of cookies left on the porch with a note from a neighbor. A songbird nesting in the gutter that didn't fly away when I passed. Even the cemetery itself felt less spooky and more sacred, the kind of place where memory settled into the earth, not fear. There was one spot I found near the back slope, where wild strawberries grew, tiny and sweet. I'd sit there with my notebook, sketching headstones and writing scraps of poetry I'd never show anyone. I stopped thinking about the lantern. I stopped thinking about the story of Mabul. That first night, with the light in the distance, I filed it away under weird but explainable and let it fade. Because the truth was, things felt okay. I felt okay, maybe even good. Looking back though, I should have known better. It always starts this way, doesn't it? With the calm. With the slow, syrupy stretch of days that make you let your guard down. That make you believe you're safe. That's how it works. The peace seeps into your bones until you forget what's under the surface. You forget that cemeteries aren't built for the living. That silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's a warning. And sometimes it's the sound of something waiting to wake up. At first the changes were so small I almost didn't register them. It started with my tools. One morning I went out to the shed to get the scythe and the rake, only to find the scythe gone. I figured I'd left it leaning against a stone somewhere and forgot about it, but after walking the entire cemetery I couldn't find it anywhere. A few days later my gloves were missing. Not Ray's, just mine. They were an old pair of leatherwork gloves my dad gave me years ago. I turned the shed upside down looking for them, even checked under the porch, but they'd simply vanished. I laughed it off at first, told myself maybe some kids were sneaking in and messing with me. But then it started happening with personal things. My watch, my sketchbook, a shirt I'd left folded on the porch rail. Gone, always gone in the morning. Nothing else in the house touched. It was like whatever, or whoever, was doing it knew exactly what belonged to me. Looking back though, that should have been my first sign. Not the lantern. Not the whispers, the missing things. It was like someone was quietly erasing me from the space piece by piece. Ray never seemed bothered. When I told him about the missing scythe, he just grunted and said, "You probably left it in the brush. Stuff gets swallowed out here." When my gloves disappeared, he shrugged and said, "Animals drag things off. Raccoons, foxes, whatever." When my watch vanished, he didn't even look up from his coffee. He just muttered, "She likes shiny things," like he was talking to himself. I asked him what he meant by she, but he waved me off, his eyes fixed on the window like he was watching something only he could see. It was the first time I realized how much he avoided my gaze when we talked about anything after dark. The cemetery itself seemed to change too. The air felt heavier in certain spots, like the humidity thickened even when the rest of the field was dry. A faint smell of wet soil would drift up from the northwest corner even on sunny days. More than once I'd catch a flicker of movement between the stones. A shadow ducking behind a monument, a flash of fabric. The worst was the scratching. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a faint sound you could mistake for a bird or a squirrel, but it came at odd times. Late afternoon when everything should have been still. Right after I'd finished cleaning a plot, like something just beneath the surface was dragging its nails across wood. Sometimes it sounded close enough to be at my feet. I told myself it was my imagination. But my skin knew better, my skin knew before my mind did. I started sleeping less. Every creak of the old house at night made me sit up. Ray still went to bed early, but I'd hear him pacing after midnight, slow, heavy footsteps across the floorboards. Once or twice I woke to see him at the window, staring out toward the cemetery, the unlit lantern on the table beside him. He never touched it while I was awake. He never told me why. But there was something about the way he stood, shoulders hunched, head tilted as if listening, that made me think he wasn't watching, he was waiting. I'll skip the boring stuff about me trying to convince myself everything was fine. The truth is, I started feeling watched. Not just when I was working, but everywhere. Inside the house, on the porch, even down by the creek. It wasn't like a person's eyes. It was heavier, colder, like the ground itself was paying attention. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, checking the corners of the room before I turned out the light. I'd dream of dirt pressing down on me, roots curling around my arms like ropes. I'd wake up gasping with the taste of soil in my mouth, even though my sheets were clean. That's when it hit me, the stories weren't just stories. Something was reaching out from under the surface. Something knew I was there. One evening, right at dusk, I asked Ray straight out if the stories about Mabel were true. He didn't answer at first. He just kept oiling a hinge on the shed door, his hands trembling slightly. Finally, he said, "Some things don't stay buried the way you think." He turned then, met my eyes for the first time all week. "Stay away from the northwest slope after dark. And for God's sake, don't answer if you hear your name." Then he shut the door and left me standing there with the sound of the lock sliding into place. The nights grew heavier, like the air itself had started to hold its breath. I couldn't put a finger on when exactly it turned, but something had shifted, and I felt it in my bones before I could explain it. There was a new silence around the house, the kind that didn't feel restful. It felt watched. I'd wake up not to noise, but to the complete absence of it. No crickets, no wind, no rustle of leaves, just this dead, pressing stillness that made the hairs on my arms rise before I even opened my eyes. A few times I woke up with the taste of rust in my mouth, like I'd been sucking on a coin in my sleep. Once I found a smudge of dirt on the inside of the window pane at head height. Not outside, inside. I tried to tell myself I must have brushed it accidentally, but I couldn't stop staring at it. It looked like a handprint, a small one. That same week, the lantern in the shed started to move. I didn't touch it, swear to God. But some mornings I'd find it in a different position, hanging slightly askew, turned toward the north slope instead of the workbench. I tested it, marked its position with a bit of chalk on the beam, and tied a string around the hook. The next day, the chalk was gone. Not rubbed off. Gone the string, untied and draped over the ladder. I told Ray, and all he said was, "She's curious, let her be." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. He was treating this like it was normal. Like the idea of a long dead woman toying with his lantern was just part of daily life. Maybe for him it was. The scratching became louder, more frequent. I'd hear it coming from multiple directions at once, beneath the porch, under the house, sometimes right outside my window. I'd lay there frozen, every muscle tight, waiting for it to stop. It never lasted long, just enough to make me wonder if I was going mad. But once I finally worked up the nerve to go outside and check, it was around 2 a.m. The moon was full, bright enough to see without a flashlight. I stepped onto the porch barefoot, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. Just stillness. Then, as I turned to go back inside, I saw something on the steps, a small, jagged stone. Not one from the driveway. This one was carved barely legible, with a corner of script still visible. It was a broken piece of a gravestone. I hadn't touched a plot in 2 days. That's when I stopped sleeping. I'd lay in bed with my eyes open, every creak of the house amplified, every distant breeze sounding like footsteps on dry grass. I tried sleeping during the day, but even then, I'd hear things, whispers beneath the floorboards, faint and just out of reach, like voices underwater. I couldn't make out the words, but they had a rhythm, a sadness, a plea. I started leaving the house lights on at night, but that only seemed to make things worse. Shadows moved behind them. I'd catch glimpses out of the corner of my eye, someone ducking behind a chair, a shape in the hallway. I stopped telling Ray about it. He wouldn't help. He'd just give me that same tired look and say, "Don't listen to the dead. They'll tell you what you want to hear," which, frankly, made things worse. I started noticing changes in Ray too. He stopped eating dinner with me. He barely spoke. He'd leave at dusk and be gone until just before dawn, the bottom of his boots caked in fresh mud. Sometimes I'd see him in the cemetery at sunrise, standing by the northwest slope, holding the lantern. But it was never lit, just hanging from his hand like a leash. He didn't walk like he used to. There was something off about his gait, a stiffness in his limbs, like gravity had started pulling at him harder than it should. Once I asked if he needed help out there, and he snapped at me, really snapped. "I told you stay away from that part," he said, his face red, eyes wild. "You ain't ready. You don't hear her right." And then, under his breath, "She still thinks it's me?" I didn't know what that meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But the next day, I finally went to the northwest corner myself. I waited until midday when the sun was strong and everything felt safe. The slope was covered in thick ferns and brambles, a tangled patch that hadn't been trimmed in years. I cleared some of it with a machete and found 5 headstones, all blank. No names, no dates, just smooth slabs of slate. One had a deep crack running across the middle. Another had scratch marks along the base, like something had clawed at it, desperate to get out. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, the machete shaking in my hand. I told myself I'd just uncovered a forgotten corner of the cemetery, something nature had claimed. But I knew better. These weren't forgotten. These were hidden. Later that night, I heard my name, not whispered, spoken. Clearly it came from the backyard, just below my window. It wasn't Ray's voice. It wasn't my mother's, or anyone I knew. It was soft, strained, like someone trying to speak through water or soil. "Mason," it said, my name, and only that once. I froze. Didn't move. Didn't breathe. I wanted to convince myself it was the wind, a dream. But my window was closed and the voice had shape, had weight. I didn't answer. But I didn't sleep either. Because the moment I turned out the light, I saw the lantern flicker to life on the porch. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone near it in days. But there it was, glowing faintly, the flame steady, casting a long shadow across the floor. The house groaned like it was trying to hold its breath. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, something scratched. And this time it didn't stop. The night I found the journal, the storm had knocked the power out. The house groaned beneath the wind, each gust rattling the window panes like something was trying to get in. I sat in the dark with a flashlight, half dazed from lack of sleep, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee and telling myself everything I'd heard, everything I'd seen, could be explained. Maybe I was cracking under the isolation. Maybe Ray was senile. Maybe the cemetery just had a history that bled into the present more easily than I'd expected. But the truth kept pressing in harder each day. And something inside me broke when I saw Ray standing outside the shed just after midnight. He was barefoot, still in his work clothes, holding the lantern high, but the flame inside was black. Not dim, not flickering, black like smoke frozen in glass. He stood there for almost an hour unmoving, and when he finally turned to go back inside, I noticed something clutched in his other hand, a small, dirt-covered bundle. He never looked at me. He never said a word. That's when I knew there was more he hadn't told me. So much more. The next morning, while Ray was still out walking the grounds, or whatever it was he did before sunrise, I went into the attic. I'd only been up there once before when I first moved in, and it had seemed harmless enough. Dusty boxes, a broken rocking chair, a stack of yellowing newspapers. But that day I noticed something different. One of the floorboards near the chimney had been disturbed, slightly darker, like someone had stepped on it with muddy boots. I pried it up with a crowbar and found a small metal lockbox buried beneath. It wasn't even locked, just latched. And inside, wrapped in a strip of old linen, was a leather-bound journal, no name on the front. Just the initials NR burned into the cover, Mabel Rayner. I took it downstairs and began reading. The entries were written in shaky cursive, ink faded in places, water damaged in others. The first few pages were innocuous grocery lists, garden plans, notes about the church's bake sale. But then things shifted. She began writing about voices in the earth, about waking up to dirt in her mouth, about dreams where she couldn't move, couldn't scream, just watched as a figure with no face stood above her, whispering something she couldn't remember when she woke. She wrote about Ray, too. How he'd started digging at night, how he wouldn't speak to her for days at a time, how he'd started claiming the graves were in the wrong places, that the dead had been moved, that they weren't sleeping right. She wrote, "He says I'm not listening to them. But how can I?" When I don't understand the language of rot, I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking too hard. When I finally gathered the nerve to finish the journal, I found the last entry was dated 2 days before the landslide. It read, "Ray's built a space below. Says it's not safe up here anymore. Says I should come see. He's lit the lantern." That was it. No signature, no final thoughts. I felt sick. The way she described Ray, his descent into obsession, the way he treated the cemetery like a living thing, was nothing like the quiet, tired man I'd been living with. Or maybe it was, and I just hadn't seen it clearly until now. I should have known better. The signs were all there. I just didn't want to believe someone who showed me kindness could also be capable of something unthinkable. The worst part came when I went out to the northwest slope again. Alone, I couldn't help myself. I brought a spade and started digging near the stone with the deepest crack. The earth there felt wrong. Not just damp, but soft, like something had been unearthed and reburied again and again. Less than 2 feet down I hit wood. Not a full coffin, something smaller. A box maybe. My breath caught. I hesitated, then cleared more dirt until the lid was exposed. There were scratch marks on it, deep ones. Not old, weathered scratches, but fresh. When I pried it open, I nearly dropped the flashlight. Inside was a bundle of cloth, and nestled in it, a rosary, a wedding ring, and what looked like fragments of a handwritten letter soaked and torn. I couldn't bring myself to read it. I didn't want to know. But what I saw last I'll never forget. At the bottom of the box, almost pressed into the wood, were 5 fingernails, human, torn, dirt still under them. I ran back to the house in the pouring rain, journal still in hand, and confronted Ray. I didn't yell, I didn't need to. I just held the book out and asked, "Did you know?" He looked at me for a long time, longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "I didn't bury her. The hill did. But she's still calling. Still wants me to find the right place." He paused, voice cracking. "And I ain't found it yet." That's when it hit me. He wasn't just a caretaker. He wasn't even a man trying to find peace for his wife. He was a man who'd lost everything and decided to listen to the voices in the dirt. And now, he wasn't alone. He had me, whether I wanted to be there or not. I left that journal on the kitchen table and told myself I was leaving in the morning, storm or no storm. Whatever Ray had turned into, whatever was happening beneath that cemetery, I wanted no part of it. The thought of staying even one more night in that house, under that roof where something old and hungry seemed to listen through the walls, made my stomach twist. I packed my bag with shaking hands, barely able to zip it. I didn't even bother with everything, just enough to leave and never look back. But when I went to get my keys, they were gone. Not misplaced, gone. The little hook by the door where I always kept them was empty. I tore the kitchen apart. Nothing. When I went to Ray's room, the door was locked. I knocked. No answer. I shouted. Nothing. And I wasn't about to break it down, not yet. Not until daylight. So I waited in the living room with the journal on my lap and the machete across my knees. The lantern sat cold on the table beside me. I watched it like it might wake up, and it did. At exactly 30:20 a.m., the glass flickered, and the flame lit itself. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. Not slamming, creaking. Like someone didn't want to wake me, but also didn't care if they did. The room was dark except for the pale orange glow of the lantern, still lit, still steady. I stood and listened. Footsteps, wet ones, tracking across the porch and into the house. And then Ray's voice. Not shouting, not angry. Calm, "You shouldn't have gone digging, Mason." I turned and saw him in the doorway, mud up to his knees, eyes blank. He wasn't holding the lantern anymore. It hovered beside him, as if the flame had attached itself to him like a shadow. I raised the machete and told him to back off, but he just shook his head. "You don't understand." She doesn't want to be found. She wants to be her. Then he stepped aside and something behind him began to move. I ran, through the back door, down the slope, across the cemetery without thinking. My flashlight was dead. My phone was gone. The only thing I had was the light from the lantern which followed me. Not floating anymore, but bouncing along the tree line, weaving in and out between graves like it was being carried by something I couldn't see. I sprinted toward the town road, hoping I could flag someone down, but the path kept twisting, looping back. No matter which direction I turned, I ended up back at the northwest corner, like the land had shifted itself to trap me there. The stones I'd uncovered looked different now, cleaner, newer, and the ground beneath my feet trembled like it was breathing. I shouted for help. Nothing, just the wind, and then the whispering began again. This time louder, more voices. Not one, a dozen, maybe more. All calling my name. All saying the same thing, it's your turn. Just when I thought I was going to lose it completely, a light came through the trees. Real light, not flame. Headlights. A pickup truck barreled down the access road and screeched to a stop. The sheriff, old man named Benji, who I'd only ever seen at the diner, got out, shotgun in hand, asking what the hell was going on. I ran to him, babbling, crying, trying to explain through the panic and noise. He didn't believe me, not at first. But then he saw the lantern still flickering on the ground, even though there was no one holding it. He stared at it, muttered something under his breath, and told me to get in the truck. As we pulled away, I saw Ray standing at the cemetery gate, eyes reflecting the taillights like an animal's. He didn't move, didn't follow, just watched, and the lantern, that damn lantern, hovered beside him, brighter than I'd ever seen it. Like it was feeding off something, maybe hope, maybe fear. At the station, I told Benji everything. Every whisper, every missing item, every unmarked grave. He didn't write any of it down, just listened quietly, like a man who'd heard similar things before but never wanted to admit it. When I finished, he said, "Ray's not a bad man, just cracked. Too long out there alone." I asked if they'd go check the slope, the graves, the box I'd uncovered. He shook his head. "That land's older than us all. We don't dig unless we want company." That was it, no rescue, no investigation. Just a quiet understanding that some parts of Briar Hollow weren't meant to be disturbed. He gave me a spare set of keys to a town-owned trailer and told me I could stay the night there. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the floor, every light on, clutching the journal like a life vest. I knew I wasn't safe. Not really. Not anymore. Because something had followed me back and feeling. And every time I blinked, every time I turned my head, it was there waiting, and somewhere in the distance, too faint for anyone else to hear, the sound of a lantern's glass clinking against a cold, skeletal hand. It's been 5 months since I left Briar Hollow, and I'm still checking over my shoulder every time the sun goes down. I tried to pretend for a while that it was all a breakdown. Stress, trauma, exhaustion. Whatever label makes it easier to live with. But I know better now. Something happened on that hill. Something older than names, older than grief. I've moved twice since then, once to a little town in Ohio, then again to a suburb outside Nashville. I thought maybe distance would help, but it hasn't. The air still feels too still at night. The floor creaks like someone's walking when I'm alone. And sometimes I wake up with dirt under my nails. I don't sleep much. I've started avoiding mirrors after dark. I've started locking my bedroom door like it'll actually do something. Deep down, I know it won't. Because I didn't just leave that place. I brought it with me. The first sign came a week after I settled in Nashville. I'd just gotten back from a grocery run, trying to stay normal, keep a schedule. When I unlocked the apartment door, the lights were already on. I know I turned them off before I left. I'm not careless like that anymore. On the kitchen table was something I hadn't seen in weeks, my watch. The same one that went missing back at Ray's house. Leather band, small scratch across the face, stopped at 30:12. The exact time the lantern lit itself that night. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I just backed out of the room and spent the night sleeping in my car. The landlord blamed it on kids and told me to call the police if it happened again. I didn't bother. I already knew they wouldn't believe myself. Then came the letters. No return address. No name. Just a plain envelope slipped under my door late at night. Inside, a torn scrap of paper from Mabel's journal. I recognized the handwriting immediately. One of the missing pages, it said, she was never buried deep. She just stopped answering. That's it. That's all it said. I burned it in the sink, but the smell clung to the apartment for days. Damp earth and something older, something that didn't want to be forgotten. After that, I stopped trying to explain it away. I knew what was happening. The lantern hadn't gone out. It had followed me. I still see it sometimes. Not directly, but out of the corner of my eye. A soft flicker through the trees when I'm walking at dusk. A reflection in a window that shouldn't be there. The worst is when I hear the scratching. It's faint, always just beneath whatever music or TV I try to drown it out with. Like something shifting under floorboards. Or under skin. I started sleeping with headphones in, but that only made it worse because then I started hearing my name whispered between the songs. Low, drawn out, like someone who never learned how to breathe right. A voice that sounds like it's coming through dirt, through wood, through coffin walls. 3 days ago, I got a call from an unknown number. No one on the other end, just silence. Then, after a few seconds, a single bell tolling slow, hollow, like the kind used in old cemeteries to signal the living underground. I dropped the phone, it didn't matter. It rang again the next night, and the next. I've stopped answering. But now, I don't need to. The sound plays sometimes from the vents, from behind the closet door, from the corners of the room when everything else is quiet. I don't know how it's following me. I don't know what it is anymore. Maybe it's not just Mabel. Maybe it never was. Maybe Ray was never searching for her grave. Maybe he was just making sure it didn't move. I think about going back. I do. Not to fight it, what good would that do? But to ask it what it wants. To stand on that slope and listen. Maybe I already am. Maybe that's what I'm doing now, telling you this. Maybe every word is part of something it needs me to say. To remember. To repeat, but I won't go back, I can't. Because I'm afraid if I set foot in that cemetery again, I won't be walking out. I'll be digging. I'll be searching. And someday someone else will see the lantern in their backyard and wonder who's holding it. Who's scratching at the floor. Who's whispering their name. I don't know what it wants. But I know this, it isn't finished. Not with you. Not with any of us. So if you ever find yourself walking alone at night and you see a lantern flickering in the distance, don't follow it. Don't speak your name out loud. And whatever you do, don't dig. I hadn't seen my uncle since I was 9 years old. The man always gave me the creeps, too quiet, always watching from behind that smudged window of his dusty farmhouse, a cigarette clenched between yellowed fingers, eyes that didn't blink enough. So when I got the call that he'd passed and left me the house and land in a town I barely remembered visiting, my first thought wasn't grief, it was confusion. Why me? I wasn't close with him, wasn't even his blood. He'd married my mom's sister and they never had kids of their own. But according to the lawyer, I was listed in his will as the sole heir. That was enough to drag me out of the city, into the heat, sick sprawl of the prairie, where everything feels miles from everything else and the wind never stops whispering. I should have known better than to accept anything from that man. The signs were all there. The dusty envelope he'd left behind with my name scratched into it, sealed with wax like some medieval nonsense. The house deed tucked inside along with a single yellowed photograph of a group of settlers standing in front of a field of unmarked wooden crosses. No note, no explanation. Just a photo, a deed, and a line at the bottom of the page, tend it or it breaks. I arrived in the town of Lark Hollow on a Thursday mid-afternoon. The roads leading in were lined with dead corn stalks and empty silos. No restaurants. Just a scatter of pale houses, wind-beaten and quiet. You could feel the age here, not just in the buildings, but in the people. The few who looked up as I drove past stared too long, too hard, not with suspicion, with recognition, like they'd seen me before, or maybe like they'd been expecting me. One old man sitting on a porch nodded once as I passed and whispered something that I swear sounded like, "She's back." The house itself sat on the edge of town, surrounded by flat land that extended into a bleak horizon. The wind cut through like a knife, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach turn. Something like burnt copper and rotting wood. Behind the house stretched a fenced-off field I hadn't noticed in the Google photos. Bare earth except for one section where the grass stopped growing entirely. From a distance, it looked like a garden of wooden posts, some leaning, some split, all arranged in rows like some forgotten orchard. But there was nothing growing from them. Nothing at all. The realtor hadn't mentioned it. Neither had the will. But the minute I stepped out of the car and saw that place, I felt something crawl across my skin, not fear. Not exactly, more like familiarity. Like part of me had seen this place before. Maybe in a dream, maybe in a nightmare. It didn't feel like I was inheriting something. It felt like I'd been returned to it. As if this land had been waiting for me to come back and finish what someone else started. I walked to the edge of the orchard. Though orchard didn't feel like the right word, despite what the locals called it. These weren't trees, they were grave markers. Old, worn, many without names. Some had symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns, looping glyphs like something scratched in a fever dream. The wind shifted, and I swear I heard a child's voice, high and soft, say the word promise. But when I turned around, there was no one there. Just the posts, just the grass, just the dry hush of the prairie. The house key turned with a rusty groan, and I stepped inside to find exactly what I expected: dust, silence, and the suffocating scent of old wood and older secrets. Furniture still covered in sheets, pictures still on the walls. The kind of place that never really lets go of its last owner. I opened a few drawers, found nothing but old receipts and matchbooks from bars that didn't exist anymore. But in the hallway closet, tucked behind a box of canning jars, I found something that stopped me cold. A small wooden box carved with the same symbol I'd seen in the orchard. Inside was a folded letter. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like it had been written by a hand not entirely in control. It read every generation one, that's the deal. Keep the land, keep the names. Let the orchard feed. If they ask, you say yes. If they rise, you do not run. If you do, they follow. The land is not yours, it uses you. Tend it or it breaks. Elias, I should have left right then. Packed up, turned the car around, and driven until the gas ran out. But I didn't. Something held me, not fear, not greed, something older, something I couldn't shake, and somewhere out past the edge of that dead orchard, something shifted in the dirt. The next morning, I started going through the house with more purpose. I'd told myself I was just looking for valuables or documents to hand off to the lawyer, but the truth was, I was looking for a reason why he chose me, a reason why he left this place to someone who barely remembered him. I thought maybe I'd find a journal, a will addendum, something to explain the orchard, the symbols, or the warning note tucked into that box. What I found was worse. The house hadn't been updated in decades. The wallpaper was yellowed and curling. The fridge didn't hum. The only sound came from the wind pressing against the windows like it was trying to get in. I moved room by room, carefully peeling back sheets from furniture, wiping away dust with the edge of my jacket. Every drawer seemed full of junk, old keys that fit nothing, receipts from butcher shops long gone, newspaper clippings too water damaged to read, until I found the study. It wasn't labeled, just another room behind a warped door frame, but the smell told me it had been used more than the rest. Tobacco and mildew. A layer of grime coated the desk, but the drawers weren't locked. I found 3 notebooks inside, each bound in crackler, the pages yellowed and thin, filled with shaky handwriting, not stories, not diary entries, logs, dates. Each entry listed a person and a symbol, followed by a single word taken, refused, or given. Some names were crossed out, some had stars next to them. One entry made my stomach drop. June 9, 2001, LRs refused, orchard unrest, watching house, warned again. That was the year I visited as a kid. I remembered because it was the summer my mom left my dad, and she sent me to stay with her sister for a week. I'd been told my uncle was funny back then, quiet but harmless. But now I remembered the tension in the air, the way adults spoke in half sentences. I remembered a night I wasn't allowed outside because the land was settling. I remembered waking up to scratching under the floorboards. Looking back though, I should have known better. The signs were all there. That visit wasn't a vacation. It was a test I was meant to be taken. Something had refused me. And now, 2 decades later, I was back, and the orchard still hadn't forgotten. Behind the notebooks was a rolled-up piece of parchment. No exaggeration. It was actual parchment, stiff and stained, covered in symbols and circles that hurt to look at. At the center was a crude drawing of the orchard, with each row labeled not with names but with generations. Volunteers, wanderers, and finally, inheritors. The last circle was empty, waiting. My name wasn't written, but the message was clear. I was next. I tried to shake it off, chalk it up to old superstition, backwoods folklore. But when I returned to the orchard later that afternoon, just to look, just to reassure myself it had changed, one of the wooden posts had fallen over. Fresh earth had been turned beneath it. No grave digging equipment, no tracks, just disturbed soil in a perfect rectangular patch. And on the wooden post itself, something new had been carved since the day before. Watcher returned. I don't know how long I stood there staring. It felt like hours. The sky shifted from gold to gray. The wind picked up, whistling through the empty trees, and I swear I heard footsteps behind me. But when I turned, there was no one, just my shadow stretching long over the dirt, just the orchard waiting, just that post, freshly carved, already rotting from the inside out. Back in the house, I flipped through the final pages of the journal. The last entry, dated just 2 days before his death. Read, if she comes back, the pact renews. The land knows. She'll feel it, she won't be able to leave. The orchard already stirs, let her tend it, I've done my time. And underneath that, a final line, scrawled so faintly it was almost illegible. They only ever sleep, the roots grow hungry. The first real sign that something was wrong came not from the orchard, but from inside the house. It was subtle, easy to overlook if I hadn't already been half on edge. I'd been reorganizing the kitchen drawers late one evening, trying to feel normal, feel grounded when I heard it. The sound of dirt hitting glass, just a soft tap, then another. I froze. The house was pitch dark aside from the light above the stove. The front yard was empty, but the sound continued, tap, tap, scatter, like small handfuls of soil being tossed against the windows from different angles. I turned off the light and moved toward the window, half expecting to see kids, or maybe just loose tree limbs blowing in the wind. But outside, the night was still. No wind, no movement. Just the endless spread of the prairie and the pale outline of the orchard in the distance. I stared for a long time, waiting for something, anything, to show itself. Then I looked down at the windowsill. Dust had gathered there the same way it had on every surface in the house. But now, a pattern had emerged, small lines, 3 across and 1 down, dragged by what looked like fingertips. The window was shut from the inside. I told myself it was nothing. That maybe I'd done it earlier without noticing. That maybe the noise had been an animal. But the next morning when I went to the porch, I found dirt. Not just scattered, but piled. 6 neat mounds, each no bigger than a fist, lined up evenly across the wooden boards, right beneath the windows. I swept them away. I didn't want to think about it. But the moment I tossed the last handful over the railing, the bell in the old church bell rang once. Just once. It was 7:43 a.m., not on the hour, not for service, just one ring, clear and sharp, and then silence. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to get groceries and maybe ask a few quiet questions. At the general store, the clerk barely looked at me. But an old woman near the door stopped me before I could leave. She leaned on her cane, didn't smile, and said, "Your uncle kept them quiet. You best learn how." I asked her what she meant. She just tapped her cane on the floor and muttered, "Too late now." When I pressed further, she turned away and said, "They've already smelled you." I couldn't shake her words. Back at the house, the wind had picked up again, blowing strong enough to rattle the glass in the back windows. But when I went outside, the air was dead still. Not a single blade of grass moved. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the old guest bed, the ceiling fan clicking overhead, my body frozen beneath the sheets. Around 3 a.m. I heard movement, slow, dragging sounds coming from the back porch. I stayed still. The sound circled the house once, then stopped. The silence was heavy, like it had weight. Then the scratching began. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't random. It was rhythmic. 3 slow scrapes, a pause, then one more. Over and over, like something trying to remember how to knock. I finally gathered the nerve to get out of bed and crept toward the back door. I didn't open it, but I pressed my ear against the wood. On the other side, something breathed. Long, low, wet. I stumbled back, and just as I did, a loud knock hit the door, not the careful scraping from before. A knock, solid, deliberate, and unmistakably human. I stared through the peephole, heart thudding. There was nothing there. The next morning, the orchard had changed again. 2 more posts had fallen. One was split down the center, revealing the inside hollow like a shell. Beneath it, the soil had been disturbed. I knelt to look closer and found something poking from the dirt. A tooth just went. Yellowed, root still attached, human. The message was getting clearer. They weren't just waiting, they were waking. I spent the next 2 days combing through everything I could find. Bookshelves, town records, even microfilm at the dusty little library 3 streets over. It started with a question: what was the Bone Orchard, and why did every record of it vanish after a certain date? The answer wasn't in plain sight, it had been buried. Just like the orchard itself. Most people I asked clammed up the moment I said the word, orchard. A few crossed themselves. One woman at the post office told me I should be careful asking about things that root too deep. But it was the church records that broke everything open. That's where the real history started to show its face. In the basement of the old church was a cabinet labeled unfiled. Inside were handwritten sermons, baptism lists, and town newsletters that never made it to print. Buried among them, wrapped in twine and tied shut with wax paper, was a journal. The title scrawled on the front, Ledger of the Earth Vault. It wasn't a journal so much as a collection of observations, starting in 1856 and ending in 1911. And what it described didn't sound or soil conditions. It sounded like a deal. According to the early entries, the settlers of Lark Hollow had been dying. Droughts, livestock illness, childbirth complications. Families dropped off the census like flies. That's when a preacher, Malachi Stroud, claimed to receive a vision from beneath. The phrasing was strange, but repeated constantly. He wrote of a force old as the stone, one that could offer protection, fertility, and strength if fed properly. The townspeople were skeptical until things got worse. A child went missing, then a woman, then a whole family. When the rains came back and the crops returned fuller than ever, the town turned silent. No one spoke about the missing again. That was the first cycle. It happened again 13 years later, then again after another generation. Always someone taken, always quietly, and always followed by an unnatural abundance. It was a pattern, a rhythm, an offering. What chilled me most was the list at the back of the ledger. Names and dates like the ones in my uncle's notebook. Taken, given, refused. Every so often, a new label appeared, escaped. And next to those names were phrases like called back or soil unrest. The connection was painfully clear. You didn't escape the pact. You only delayed it. Those marked would return eventually, whether they wanted to or not. I flipped frantically through the pages looking for something, anything, about my family. And then I found it. April 1929 to G. Halverson refused, fled north. Her line marked. Halverson was my grandmother's maiden name. My mother never spoke of her family, always said they didn't talk anymore. I thought it was estrangement, some long-forgotten fight. But it was deeper than that. My great-grandmother had fled this town, refused to give an offering, and that refusal was passed down like blood. That's how I ended up here. I wasn't chosen because I was close to my uncle. I was chosen because I wasn't. I represented an old broken branch, one that had been ignored too long. Now the land was collecting its due. When I left the church basement, the wind was screaming. I don't mean blowing. I mean screaming, like someone standing just outside the threshold of hearing shrieking into the grain. I rushed back to the house, heart pounding, only to find the front door wide open and the kitchen light on. I knew I hadn't left it like that. Inside, the smell of soil was overwhelming, wet, rich, and sharp, like the ground had come in to reclaim something. The notebooks were scattered, the pages torn and tossed, and carved into the wood of the kitchen table. In that same looping symbol I'd seen etched into the orchard post was a single word, ode. I collapsed in the hallway. Not out of fear, not at that point. Out of something deeper. Helplessness. The kind you feel when you realize you were never free. I thought inheritance meant receiving something. But what I got wasn't a gift. It was a sentence. That night, the orchard began to hum. I could feel it through the floorboards, like something breathing through the bones of the house. I woke up to scratching again, but this time it wasn't at the door or the window. It was under my bed. Low, steady, and too slow to be a mouse. It was the kind of sound that worms its way past your ears and starts feeding directly into your nerves. I didn't scream. I just froze, pulling my knees to my chest, not even breathing, and then I heard something worse than a voice. It was just a whisper, no more than 4 or 5 words. I still don't know what language it was, but it felt old, like it was being spoken through teeth that had been buried too long. I reached over, grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it beneath the bed. Nothing. But the floorboards were scratched. Not fresh gudges, not animal scrapes, symbols. 3 rings nested like ripples in water, and in the center a crude X slashed through with a jagged line. It matched the ones I'd seen in the orchard and the kitchen. The message was growing louder. That morning, the orchard looked different. Not the layout, that hadn't changed, but the feeling had shifted. The birds no longer sang. And for the first time I noticed there were no insects. No bees, no gnats. No flies buzzing around the fresh, disturbed dirt. It was like even the pests knew to stay away. I walked the rows with a shovel. Not because I planned to dig anything up, but because some part of me felt safer holding it. By the 3rd row, I stopped. One of the mounds was shaking. Just faintly, barely visible unless you were staring directly at it. But the soil was pulsing. I stepped back, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it, a finger. Human, pale, bloated, rising from the ground like it had been reaching for the surface. No movement, no twitch. Just posed upright, the nail caked in blood, pointing directly at me. I ran. Back inside the house? Anyone. My mom, the lawyer, even Megan, the real estate rep. No answer, voicemail, dead tone, or endless ringing. My phone app glitched and refused to show my GPS location. When I looked outside, I noticed the mailbox had changed. It had been a rusty tin box with no flag. Now it was freshly painted bright red. On the front, in black marker, someone had written, "That night the house came alive." It started with the walls groaning, then came the smell. Earth and rot, thick as if something had died in the vents. I checked every room, every crawl space. Nothing. But when I opened the cellar door, I found the stairs coated in damp soil. At the bottom, the old root cellar smelled like a grave. I shined my flashlight into the corners and saw the outlines of small figures. Not people, effigies. Dolls made from twine and bone, arranged in rows, each with a name pinned to its chest. Mine was in the front. Its eyes were missing. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light on, the fireplace blazing, and the notebooks and ledgers stacked around me like a barrier. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I woke, the fire was out, the lights were dead, and the house was humming. No, not the house. The land, the entire foundation vibrated, like something massive was moving beneath it. Outside, the orchard was glowing, not brightly. Just a dull, sickly green shimmer that moved across the soil in waves like heat on asphalt. I walked out onto the porch and stood there, too stunned to move. That's when I saw the figures. They stood between the posts, just silhouettes, unmoving, each exactly where a name had once been carved. Some were tall, some were hunched, one was crawling. I couldn't see faces. But I saw hands, all of them pointed toward the house. Toward me, I whispered, "What do you want?" And all at once the bell rang. Not the church bell in town. The one from the orchard. The one no one had ever seen, but every generation heard. It rang once. Then again. 7 times in total. When it stopped, I was already crying, already stepping back into the house, already locking the door behind me. Not that locks mattered, not here. Not with the ground breathing and the trees creaking and the past clawing its way up from the dirt to collect its price. Looking back, though, I realize now the bell didn't signal their arrival. It signaled mine. I hadn't inherited the house. I'd been planted. By the following morning, the entire orchard was stripped of silence. The trees had begun to creak in unison, as if swaying to a rhythm only the dead could hear. I tried to convince myself that I'd lost track of time, that the bell, the dolls, the glowing earth, maybe it had been a fever dream. But when I opened the cellar again, the effigy with my name was gone, replaced with a fresh mound of soil right at the bottom step, and someone had scratched the word headstone into the wall above it. That's when I decided I had to leave. I packed a duffel bag with everything I could grab, documents, my phone, the old notebook, 2 changes of clothes. The moment I stepped onto the porch, a dead bird fell from the sky and hit the steps at my feet. Its wings twitched once, then went still. The moment I opened my car door, the wind kicked up hard, slamming it shut. Dust flew from the orchard in violent spirals, blinding me. I tried again, yanking the door open, but the ignition wouldn't turn over. The battery had been fine the day before. I popped the hood. Inside, every wire had been chewed clean through, somehow overnight. No tracks, no prints. Just torn plastic and copper curls, like something had fed. I ran into town on foot, but by the time I reached the diner, it was empty. Not closed, empty. Coffee still steaming on the counter. A jukebox humming low in the corner. Plates half-eaten, doors unlocked, lights on. Not a soul in sight. It was like the world had pressed pause and left me in the middle. I checked the town hall, the church, even the tiny one-room fire station. All deserted. Not looted, not panicked. Just vacant. As if they'd known. As if they'd left me behind. That's when I remembered the journal, the one in the church basement. I sprinted back, tore open the cabinet again, flipped through every page of vol, and found the reference to something called The withering rite. It was only mentioned once, a last resort, a ritual that could transfer the debt. The instructions were vague, cryptic, but I understood enough. If I gave the orchard someone else, someone alive, someone who wasn't marked, it might release me. That thought made me sick. But it also filled me with a quiet terror. Someone had done this before, I saw it clearly then. Why my uncle never married, never had kids, never even left town. He hadn't inherited the house, he'd inherited the debt, and the only reason he was allowed to live so long was because he stayed close to the soil. He fed it little pieces of himself, never leaving, never letting go of the pack. But when he died without offering someone else in his place, it returned to the last marked line. Me. I burned the effigies in the cellar, every single one. I screamed curses into the dirt, smashed every framed photo of the orchard, poured bleach over the floorboards where the symbols had been scratched. That night the orchard didn't glow, it howled. The trees bent toward the house, their limbs scraping the glass like claws. The sky turned a shade of black I'd never seen before, thicker than night, as if light itself had left the area. At 3:17 a.m. the floor in my bedroom cracked open. Not a hole, a split, a jagged fracture down the middle of the room, revealing soil beneath, wet and breathing. I backed away, heart pounding, when I saw fingers begin to rise. Then skeletal, no skin, just yellowing bone wrapped in veins like vines. They reached for the air, then turned toward me. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, across the yard, barefoot, bleeding, not even feeling the cuts. Every mound of soil freshly turned, symbols glowing dull red. I fell to my knees at the edge of the first row and screamed, "Adot duo omont." And then I heard it, not a voice. Not out loud, it came from inside me. A presence, ancient. Cold balance. That's all it said, balance. I had broken the cycle by trying to run, by refusing to give, by burning what had been accepted. The soil wasn't angry, it was starving, and now it would take everything. As I stumbled back into the house, I felt something press into my hand. I opened my palm and saw a small tooth. Not the one I'd found earlier, a new one. It was smooth, ivory white, and still warm. And carved into the surface was the same mark I'd seen etched into the orchard post, 3 rings, and a jagged X. The pact was alive again, and it had chosen me to finish the harvest. I wish I could tell you I left that town, that I made it out and never looked back. But that wouldn't be the truth. The truth is, I never really left, not completely. You don't walk away from something like the Bone Orchard. You don't pack your bags, lock the door, and leave a place like this behind. Because the thing is, once your name is in the soil, you are the soil, and it remembers you. I stayed in that house for 3 more days after the crack opened in my bedroom floor. The finger bones never fully emerged. They just hovered there beneath the boards like roots testing the surface. Waiting, watching. The whispering never stopped either. Sometimes it came from the walls, sometimes from the pipes. Once, I swear it came from my own reflection. And each time it said something different, half words, fragments, some in languages I've never heard spoken aloud. But the meaning was always the same. You are part of this now. On the 4th day, the wind shifted not just in direction, but in temperature, pressure, even tone. It stopped carrying dust and brought something colder, heavier. When I stepped outside that morning, the trees had grown, not taller, closer. Each trunk now stood within arm's reach of the next. The orchard wasn't just surrounding the house anymore. It was consuming it, growing toward it like vines toward sunlight. And in the center of the yard, a new mound had appeared, one I hadn't seen before. No headstone, no markings. Just fresh, soft dirt, and a single tooth resting neatly on top. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Later that night I heard digging, not with shovels, not tools, just hands, scraping, pulling, clawing. I opened the front door and saw nothing, but the sound grew louder, closer, like it was under the porch, then the floor, then beneath my bed again. That's when I knew something was trying to come through. I tried leaving one more time, packed light, didn't even take my phone. Just enough to walk down the road and not stop. I made it 6 miles before my legs gave out, not from exhaustion, from pain. A searing, bone-deep kind of pain, like my body was being pulled backward with invisible hooks. Every step became harder, my vision blurred, my ears rang, and then I collapsed. I woke up just before dawn at the foot of the orchard. My bag was gone. My clothes were clean. My feet were bare. There were no tracks behind me, only ahead, leading directly into the trees. And standing between the rows in the exact center was a figure holding a lantern. It was a man. Or at least it had been. His face was half bone, half flesh. His hands were black with soil. His clothes were old, Civil War era, maybe older. And the lantern he held glowed with that same sickly green light I'd seen days before. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But I knew who he was. He was the first. The one who made the deal. The one who gave the orchard its name. He lifted the lantern, turned, and walked between the mounds. And I followed. I don't remember what happened after that. Just flashes. Roots wrapping around my wrists, breathing in dirt like air. A voice deep and full of centuries saying, "No, you see." When I woke, I was in my bed. The house was quiet. The orchard still. No trees scraping the windows, no bones beneath the floor. For a moment I thought maybe it was over, that I had given enough, that the cycle had closed. But that was 2 weeks ago. And last night, the bell rang again, only once. But it wasn't from the orchard this time, it came from under the house. This morning I found a note nailed to the porch. Scrawled in dirt, stained handwriting, barely legible. But undeniably real, the soil remembers, the pact holds, one must feed. Looking back, I should have known better. The signs were all there, the symbols, the silence, the warmth beneath the ground. I thought inheritance was about property, about legacy. But this wasn't passed down like a house or a name. It was passed down like a curse buried with each generation, only to be unearthed when someone foolish enough tried to dig up the truth. If only I had listened. If only I had walked away. Now I wait. Not because I want to, because I have to. Because the land doesn't just demand something, it demands someone. And I'm running out of names in the ledger.